Melissa Cole had a traumatic childhood.
She saw things that a child should never have to see.
But her husband, Gary, promised her a better life.
He basically swept her off her feet.
Trips to Jamaica, Cancun.
However, their 11-year relationship would end in tragedy.
By the time firefighters got there, the house was pretty much gone.
He was just charred black.
And the aftermath would have the authorities wondering, was the fire an accident?
I think the heater was on.
Or did their marriage mask a deadly secret?
She was quite graphic.
That was hard to listen to.
In the end, it would all come down to the word of the couple's 9-year-old son.
Kids don't, they just tell you what to hear. They'll just tell you what they see.
McNairy County, Tennessee, November 3rd, 2009. It was around 1:30 a.m. when a neighbor dialed 911 and reported a fire at the home of Gary and Melissa Cole.
We woke up smelling smoke, and he goes out onto his back porch and sees it's the Cole residence.
Firefighters rushed to the scene, a remote rural area 2 hours east of Memphis.
There's some farms out there, some cattle farms. There's some timberland out there.
The houses in that area are kind of pretty far apart.
Many of those houses belong to Gary Cole's extended family. And by the time the firefighters arrived, several of them had gathered outside the burning house, anxious for the safety of Melissa, Gary, and their 9-year-old son.
There were already flames coming out of some of the windows in the roof.
I'd go from window to window and I'd scream into the house and ask if anybody was in there. I said, "Can you hear me?"
There was no answer.
I didn't know if the smoke had overcome them or if they were already burned up or, what kind of situation it was.
And if Melissa, Gary, and their son were inside, there appeared to be little chance of survival. By the time the flames were out, the Coles' home was nothing but a charred ruin.
You could see some of the 2x4 sticking up, a little bit of the structure was still there, but for the most part, it was pretty much destroyed.
And as the firefighters sifted through the wreckage, they made a grisly discovery: a man's body.
They were able to determine from the size of the individual that it was in fact a male.
However, that was all they could determine about the body sprawled out on the smoldering remains of the living room couch.
He was just charred black.
They believed it to be Gary Cole.
But if it was Gary Cole, where was his wife Melissa and the couple's 9-year-old son? Growing up in Knoxville, Tennessee, Melissa Broadwater, known as Missy to her family, had a tough childhood.
She saw things that a child should never have to see.
According to her mother, Melissa regularly witnessed the beating she suffered at the hands of Melissa's father.
She's seen a lot of abuse at a very young age.
Although only 5 years old when her parents divorced, she may have been too young to totally understand what she had seen.
She asked, "Why didn't you stay with my daddy, Mama?" I explained to her I couldn't stay with your daddy. Your daddy was going to kill me.
Unfortunately, her parents' divorce didn't bring stability. After the split, Melissa and her mother moved to Nashville, where Kay met and married a new man.
He was also verbally and physically abusive to Melissa's mother.
Only by then, Melissa was old enough to understand.
One night, he was knocking me around, and she goes out screaming in the middle of the night, "Oh my God, he's going to kill her, murder, murder, murder." And I think she was 10 or 11.
Melissa's mother eventually left her new husband, but the traumatic upbringing had already taken its toll on Melissa, who grew up to be a troubled teen.
Melissa dropped out of high school after her junior year.
After dropping out, Melissa took a receptionist job at the electrical company where her mother worked.
I thought if she went to work, she'd go back to school. When she found out how hard the adult world was.
Instead, the 17-year-old met a man, a 24-year-old electrician named James Bear.
I think it was his life experience and his attention toward her that drew her to him.
Melissa may have appreciated the older man's attention, but her mother didn't.
Melissa's mom did not allow her to date James because of the significant age difference.
Not that her mother could keep the pair apart for long.
The night she turned 18, she told me, she said, I want to be with James.
She moved out, moved in with James.
Melissa and James married in 1987, and soon after, she was pregnant.
She was so happy that she was pregnant and going to be a mom and prove to the world that she was going to be a good mom.
And when her daughter was born in 1988, Melissa quit her job to stay home with the little girl.
She was ecstatic. All she wanted to do was spend time with her baby.
3 years later, Melissa and James had a second child, a son.
She was always supportive of both her children. That was her life.
She was a great mom. I was really involved with my schooling and everything.
But after almost a decade as a dedicated stay-at-home mom, Melissa went back to work in 1998.
To help bring in a little income, Melissa picked up a part-time job as a secretary at the electric company that James worked at in Nashville.
The fact that the couple was working together didn't mean they were close, however. James was nearly 40. Melissa had just turned 30, and the couple started growing apart.
He was more trying to be a homebody, and Missy was still young.
And after more than 10 years together, Melissa's marriage had apparently grown stale. All the passion was gone.
It was just like she was just there for him, just to clean the house or make supper. And, you could see the hurt in her.
At least one of Melissa's co-workers took notice. His name was Gary Cole. Although he was a few years older than James, carefree and fun-loving Gary was hardly a homebody.
He would make trips to Jamaica, Cancun, and he would take maybe 1 or 2 cruises a year, and he stayed very socially active.
And it wasn't long after Melissa started back with the electrical company that Gary began stopping by her desk.
Just flirting with her, giving her compliments.
He did show her a lot of attention and showed interest in what she was doing.
Considering how neglected and underappreciated Melissa was feeling in her marriage, she was more than happy to reciprocate Gary's attention.
The attention that Gary showed Melissa made her feel worth something.
It made her feel good, to feel wanted.
James wasn't giving her that.
Soon, Melissa and Gary were having an affair.
He basically swept her off her feet.
All of a sudden, everything that she was doing was for Gary. Her family suffered from this. She didn't spend time with her children.
And it wasn't long after the affair started that Melissa discovered she was pregnant with Gary's child. For Melissa, her new pregnancy was the catalyst to leave her old life and her unhappy marriage.
She was the one that moved out of the house. And it was fairly quick.
But the bigger shock was that Melissa didn't just leave her husband behind.
She had asked me if I would watch the kids, and I said sure. And she said she'd be back the next day, and she didn't come back.
Melissa's family was stunned that the devoted mother would abandon her 8-year-old son and 11-year-old daughter.
It was hard for me to understand what was happening when I was younger.
How could she go from being this loving mother, this caring woman to these children and then leaving them?
And I begged her then, Missy, please make me understand why you're leaving these kids. I can't understand you.
Melissa's mother never got an answer. Soon after shacking up with Gary in 1999, Melissa severed all contact with her family.
We would try to call her and she wouldn't answer the phone.
Melissa put some physical distance between herself and her family, too. Once she left James and the kids, she and Gary moved to rural McNairy County, nearly 3 hours away.
Melissa's life became all about Gary.
She changed. I mean, from a loving mother and wife and daughter to where it was like this man was her God.
Gary changed too, according to his family, especially after the birth of his son in the spring of 2000.
I noticed that he was very sensible about things. He was more family-oriented than he had been before.
Once her divorce from James was finalized, Melissa and Gary married in 2001, and the couple enjoyed their new life together.
He would take trips with her, and they would take some small vacations every time they got a chance.
But it wasn't long after the wedding that things began to change. Now that he was in his 40s, Gary was no longer up to the physical demands of the construction trade.
He was having problems climbing, having problems walking because the cartilage in both of his knees it was completely gone.
Work became scarce and money became tight.
At one point, I think the electric company had turned off the electricity.
However, the couple's troubles did have one positive outcome. After several years of avoiding them, Melissa reached out to her family and the children she had abandoned.
I think she realized that she did regret the decision.
There were phone calls at first.
She wanted to talk to me. She wanted to know what was going on, and I was just glad to hear her and talk to her.
And then Melissa took her youngest son to Nashville to spend time with his half-siblings.
She would come down and be for a little while.
Sometimes it would be for a few days, and sometimes it would be for weeks.
However, no matter how long the visit, Melissa's mother said she was always shocked at the change in her daughter.
It was like she was scared to be assertive. She was always watching around. She wouldn't raise her voice. There was so much difference in her.
She was just a different Missy. She was looking at you like she was listening, but she was empty inside.
I mean, she was an outgoing, boisterous person, you know. And then all of a sudden, she's meek as a mouse.
Just what had happened to leave Melissa so meek and empty remained a mystery, however. According to Melissa's mother, whenever she asked Melissa what was wrong, the answer was always the same.
Mom, I'm all right.
Coming up, sheriff's deputies search for Melissa and her son.
We didn't know if somebody had abducted the mother and the child.
And the fire marshals noticed something strange about the blaze.
It had burned downward instead of upward.
McNairy County, Tennessee, November 3rd, 2009. It was around 1:30 in the morning when firefighters arrived on the scene of a devastating blaze at the home of Melissa and Gary Cole.
By the time firefighters got there, the house was pretty much gone.
And there appeared to be little hope for Melissa, Gary, and their 9-year-old son.
Nobody knew exactly where anybody was, and the neighbors were concerned that both Gary and Melissa may have still been in the residence.
Then, once the flames were out, the firefighters sifted the smoldering wreckage and delivered the devastating news to the small crowd of friends and family who had gathered outside the house.
One of the firemen came out and told me that, said we found a body inside. And he said it's a male body.
An adult male, presumably Gary Cole. However, if Gary had perished in the fire, where were Melissa and his son?
We were trying to find out and make sure she was okay and he was okay, the child.
Sheriff Roten came up and suggested that I try to call her, so I tried to call her on cell phone, and it rang and rang.
We continuously tried to call that number, and there was no answer at all at that number.
While family members tried to reach Melissa, the authorities carefully removed what remained of the body.
We just tried to remove it as best we could and put it in a body bag.
The body was so badly burned that determining its identity was beyond the ability of the county examiner. So the McNairy County authorities sent it directly to the West Tennessee Regional Forensic Center.
We sent him to Memphis at that time, and they had to identify him and tell us what it is or who it is.
Then, once the body was removed, the scene was turned over to arson investigators from the McNairy County Fire Marshal's office.
They work those type of situations. They're trained, and they'd go through there and eventually tell you where the fire started, what started the fire.
It was dirty, dangerous, and time-consuming work.
It was, by definition, very difficult to work. There had already been just extensive damage to the structure. The folks from the Barman Arson Squad, including a K-9 that they had to help them in their investigation, were at some risk of being injured themselves while they were attempting to sort through the debris that was left by the fire.
But the work had barely begun before one of the lead investigators noticed something significant.
One of the things he noticed very early on was the smell of what he classified as an accelerant.
To the trained eye of the arson investigators, the burn patterns in the kitchen were also suspicious.
It had burned downward instead of upward, indicating that something had been poured out on the floor and set on fire. Obviously, I don't think he could say whether it was kerosene or gasoline or camp fuel or anything particular, but he did notice that smell early on.
Taken together, that could mean only one thing: arson.
They knew it had been started in the general area of the kitchen, dining room area, and ever who started the fire went out the kitchen door, which had been on the end of the house away from the road.
But who had set the fire? And where were Melissa and her little boy?
Was there a third party involved in this situation? Have they been taken somewhere against their will?
We didn't know if somebody else had robbed them or did something to them and abducted the mother and the child.
I was concerned about both of them.
For the entire morning, while the medical examiner's staff and arson squad had been at work, the family had continued to try and contact Melissa.
They were calling Melissa's phone nonstop with no answer, no response.
I couldn't tell you how many times that number was called.
I would leave messages and she wouldn't return my call.
But then, after several hours on the phone, Gary's brother checked his messages and finally received word from Melissa.
She had called my answering machine and asked if we had seen Gary.
Judging by her message, Melissa had no idea that there had been a fire and no idea that her husband was dead.
She said, well, I've been looking for him everywhere. I said, if y'all see him, tell him I'm looking for him.
Gary's brother called Melissa back, and this time she answered.
She said, have you seen Gary? And I said, haven't you heard? She said, heard what?
Gary's brother told Melissa that her husband was dead.
She got quiet. She said, well, what happened? I said, he burned in a fire.
Then, Gary's brother told Melissa that she should contact the county sheriff, that he wanted to talk to her. So that afternoon, Melissa met with investigators at the McNairy County Sheriff's Department.
It wasn't a interrogation or anything like that. We just sat down and asked her, said, what's going on? That's pretty much the way it went. And we didn't have to read her rights or anything because she wasn't charged with anything.
Just hours after being told that her husband had died in a devastating fire, Melissa still appeared to be in shock.
I don't remember her being just absolutely tore up. You know what I'm saying? Like, her husband died. I don't remember her just being crazy upset.
Instead, Melissa said she was confused. She told the investigators that Gary wasn't even supposed to be home the night before, that he was supposed to be in Memphis.
She said he had left the area, going, I believe, to Shelby County for a job interview, that he would be gone for 1 or 2 or even 3 days.
Gary was taking off for a few days and going to Memphis to try to find a job. Said he'd met some guy that he knew down there and he was going to go see about getting a job there.
Melissa told the investigators that she had taken her son to Nashville for a few days to visit her family.
She was going to go to her mother's house.
And that was where Melissa had been when Gary's brother broke the tragic news that her husband was dead.
It's the first she'd heard of anything was when they told her that there had been a fire and that Gary had been found.
But if Gary was supposed to be in Memphis, how did he end up dead in a house fire back home? When the investigators followed up with Gary's family, they said they were just as puzzled as Melissa.
Taking off for a few days and going to Memphis to try to find a job was strange because Gary doesn't do anything like that without talking to me first. And he wouldn't have gone without telling my mother either.
Had Gary been trying to hide something? The sheriff's investigators couldn't be sure. But by then, Gary was in Memphis at the West Tennessee Regional Forensic Center. The autopsy confirmed that the body the firefighters pulled from the charred remains of the Cole home was indeed Melissa's husband.
They had to identify him through the dental records.
That much local law enforcement expected. But the autopsy report also contained a surprise. Gary hadn't died in the fire. He'd been shot.
During an autopsy, they found a gunshot to the back of Gary's head.
He called me and told me, your brother was shot with a 9mm to the back of the head. And he said he never felt anything. I said, clipped his spinal cord, said he died instantly, if it's any consolation.
And it didn't appear to be a suicide.
There were no weapons near Gary's body.
The way the trajectory of the bullet was on him, it would have been impossible for him to do that himself.
And if Gary hadn't shot himself, that could mean only one thing. He was murdered.
Somebody walked up behind him and shot him.
Coming up, an unlikely witness cracks the case.
Things just started falling in place.
And Melissa makes a shocking revelation.
He had the gun sound.
By the afternoon of November 4th, it had been more than 24 hours since firefighters had pulled a badly burned body from the McNairy County, Tennessee home of Melissa and Gary Cole.
It was completely charred, and you couldn't identify who the person was.
Through dental records, the state medical examiner had eventually confirmed that the body was that of Melissa's husband, Gary. But that wasn't all that the autopsy had determined.
The medical examiner's report came back and indicated that Gary had died of a gunshot wound.
We knew it was, at that point, it was a homicide.
But who would kill Gary? Thanks to the destruction from the fire, the crime scene offered few clues.
We just knew that the body we had a bullet wound in the back of his head.
The fact that Melissa and her son weren't home when the blaze destroyed their house did give the investigators an obvious starting point, however.
You start looking at the people closest to them, and then you go from there.
What's going on in their lives that may have led to this?
When the investigators made discreet inquiries with Gary's family, they told the sheriff's deputies that the couple had been experiencing money trouble.
The phone company was going to turn off his phone, and the garbage company said that they were almost 3 years behind.
But the family stopped short of accusing Melissa of killing her husband.
I just couldn't imagine her going to that length, to do something like that. I mean, they'd had problems in the past, but we're talking about murder.
In fact, based on what the family told the investigators, if Melissa had wanted to get rid of Gary, all she had to do was wait. 3 months earlier, on August 10th, Gary had filed for divorce.
It was an uncontested divorce. She had signed a marital dissolution agreement that provided for the division of their property and for the custody and care of their son.
And just like her split from her first husband, Melissa had been more than willing to walk away from the child she had with Gary.
She was to relinquish any kind of custody. Gary was going to have custody of her.
In fact, the split appeared to be so amicable that Melissa stayed in the house, sleeping in a back bedroom while the divorce was finalized.
I felt like that she needed to be out. And he said, the way it is right now, said she's going to stay away from us. She's going to stay in the back, and I want to stay in my room.
But had Melissa eventually come to regret her decision to relinquish custody? The McNairy County authorities started to wonder, considering the timeline of the pending divorce.
In a matter of a few days, I think about 8 days, it was going to be final.
At that point, Melissa became suspect number 1.
On Thursday, November 5th, the McNairy County Sheriff's deputies asked Melissa to come in for more questioning. And this time, they asked her to bring the couple's 9-year-old son with her.
Usually kids don't. They just tell you what to hear. They'll just tell you what they see.
Once at the sheriff's department, the investigators separated mother and son and placed them in separate interrogation rooms. Then, while letting Melissa stew, they focused their efforts on her son.
We got the proper juvenile authorities in there, and they started talking to the boy.
Right away, his story began to differ from his mother's, starting with the fact that his father had been home all weekend.
She said he was supposed to be in Memphis looking for a job.
Contradicting his mother's story was only the first of many revelations, however. He also told the investigators that he had been in bed on Sunday night, roughly 24 hours before the fire, when he woke to a loud bang. Whether it was a gunshot or not, the boy couldn't say, but he had been startled enough to get out of bed to investigate.
And he went in there to see what the noise was that he heard. And he said he saw his mother standing there, and he asked her what that was. And she said that she had been wrapping Christmas presents.
Melissa had explained to him that she had dropped something while she was wrapping presents.
The investigators were fairly certain that was a lie.
He heard the gunshot.
And they based the assumption on what Melissa's son told them next. The 9-year-old said that he'd gone back to bed that night. But when he got up a few hours later, his father was laying on the couch, completely covered with a blanket.
Mom was telling him Daddy's sick, sleeps sick on the couch, and don't bother him.
In fact, the boy told the investigators that his mother had made sure that he left his father alone. Rather than homeschool him like she normally did, his mother had taken him out all day to run a series of errands.
One of the most bizarre elements to this story are the shopping trips that Melissa took.
She bought a mop, some Clorox, and some cleaning materials.
And in between trips, they returned to the house.
She told him to stay in the car.
Melissa's son said he didn't know what his mother had been up to, but the investigators had a theory.
She tried to clean up first.
But those attempts must have failed, because according to her son, when Melissa came out of the house the last time, well after dark, he smelled smoke.
Things just started falling in place from his statement, you know.
The cops believe they knew what she had done, when she'd done it, and what she had done to cover it up.
Now all they needed to do was call her on it. Once they finished questioning her son, the investigators stepped into the next interrogation room where Melissa waited. And this time, the interview was very different from the casual conversation they'd had with Melissa 2 days earlier.
That's when we started questioning her and taking notes and read her rights.
Then, once they read Melissa her rights, the investigators explained what her son had just told them.
We had convinced her we knew what would happen.
Confronted with her son's story, Melissa quickly broke down.
Do you remember giving the sheriff a statement, I believe, yesterday morning?
Yeah.
Is that statement the truth?
No.
She didn't have a choice. She had to tell what happened.
She realized that she was not going to be able to fabricate enough to cover her tracks.
According to Melissa's new statement, she and Gary had argued early on the morning of November 2nd while their son was still asleep.
We just got into not even a big argument. I mean, it wasn't even a big argument.
But it had taken a dangerous turn, according to Melissa. She told the investigators that while they were arguing in the living room, Gary had stormed into the bedroom and come back with a gun.
He usually kept it under his side of the bed.
Once back in the living room, Melissa said that Gary had ordered her to sit down, that they needed to talk.
He had the gun sat on his lap in the living room. That's what he was telling me. I know you're thinking about leaving.
Melissa said that Gary, much like the investigators, had suspected that she was having second thoughts about their custody agreement, that he believed Melissa was planning to take their son and flee.
I've told him, I said, Gary, I'm not leaving.
The argument apparently settled. Melissa said that Gary had taken the gun back into the bedroom and that he had eventually fallen asleep on the sofa. But she also admitted that, frightened by her husband's threatening behavior, she had decided to act.
She needed to protect herself because her knowing how he was, he would might get up and finish. So she had to stop him.
So according to Melissa, she had gone into the bedroom, retrieved Gary's gun, and returned to where he lay dozing on the sofa.
And I walked over there behind him and shot him.
She admitted she had shot and killed Gary Cole in her home as he lay on the sofa.
We had quite a bit of evidence, you know, of what happened, and we just wanted her to tell us. You always want somebody to say, yeah, I did it.
However, there was still one thing to admit to: the fire.
I didn't burn the house, I don't think. I think the heater was on, but I don't think I burned the house.
It's a bit curious that she would not go ahead and admit that she did that as well.
You've got your husband that's been shot there in the living room. How did you think his body was going to disappear?
You know, this is not right, but I didn't even think about it disappearing.
She told us after she shot him, killed him, everything was just in a blur.
It was kind of like everything was moving in slow motion.
Not that it mattered much whether Melissa admitted to lighting the fire or not. She had confessed to shooting her husband. And once the interview was over, the sheriff's deputies placed Melissa under arrest for murder.
I was totally surprised that it was a murder charge because it should be self-defense. She was just trying to protect herself.
Coming up, Melissa's son testifies against his mother.
He was dumbfounded by what had happened. It had really torn him apart.
And Melissa makes a series of disturbing allegations about her dead husband.
She was quite graphic.
McNairy County, Tennessee, October 5th, 2010. Almost a year after her husband's body was found in the smoldering remains of their home, 42-year-old Melissa Cole stood trial for his murder.
You could tell she was scared. I don't think she had ever even had a speeding ticket that I knew of. Now she's up for murder.
According to the prosecution's opening statement, Melissa had murdered Gary Cole to gain custody of their son.
When he filed for divorce, she agreed to let him have her son.
Their divorce was set to be final in less than a week.
But despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that she had already abandoned 2 children during a previous breakup, the prosecution claimed that Melissa got cold feet as the divorce deadline approached.
She didn't want to walk away from that son because she had already, had 2 children left behind. And I feel that she didn't want to leave him.
So according to the prosecution's theory, Melissa decided to settle the custody issue once and for all on the morning of November 2nd, 2009.
She chose to take a gun and point it at the back of his head and end his life.
And that, the prosecutors claimed, made Melissa guilty of first-degree murder.
There had to be some deliberation to go and take those actions with your child in the next room.
The prosecution also argued that Melissa's actions after the shooting showed even more deliberation.
The fact that she tried to clean up first and then burn the house down. Once again, these are not things that you do when you react in the heat of passion. These are calculated actions.
She probably thought, I'll burn the house and he'll go away.
But she was wrong, according to the prosecutors. They opened their case by calling fire investigators to the stand to testify about the telltale signs of arson.
They knew that there had been some type of an accelerant that had been used to set the house on fire.
But the most compelling testimony against Melissa came from her son. Now 10 years old, the prosecutors called him to testify against his mother.
The son really was the most important witness the state had.
He was key, and my heart goes out to him. He is certainly the remaining victim.
On the stand, it was clear that the boy was still struggling with the effects of what he had witnessed.
It was just like he was dumbfounded by what had happened. It had really torn him apart.
In his testimony, her son laid out everything he had previously told the investigators. The loud bang, his father covered up by the blanket, and his mother's strange behavior over the next 24 hours.
He was able to say the time of death, where they went shopping, what they bought, everything they did the entire day, up until he smelled smoke that night.
Most damning of all, the jurors heard the confession Melissa had made on the evening of November 5th, 2009, just 3 days after Gary's death.
Walked over there behind him. And shot him.
Our own confession is some of the strongest evidence that can be presented against him.
When it was the defense's turn, they didn't deny that Melissa had shot Gary. Instead, their open focused on another part of Melissa's statement, her claim that Gary had supposedly threatened her with a gun before the shooting.
And he came out there with that little black gun.
According to the defense, that was hardly the first time Gary had threatened Melissa. In fact, they claimed that he had done far worse. According to the defense, Melissa was a battered woman.
The defense's entire case revolved around claims that Gary had abused Melissa for years.
For Melissa's family, it was the confirmation of something they had long suspected.
I had my doubts about it being a good relationship. She never formally ever came right out and told me.
But she would tell her story now. Melissa took the stand in her own defense.
She felt like once they realized what the truth was, how she was being abused, the law would back her up.
In her testimony, Melissa claimed that Gary's abuse was physical and sexual.
She started making the allegations of the severe physical abuse and severe, what I consider to be severe sexual abuse. She was quite graphic.
At one point, he had raped her with a gun. So that was hard to listen to.
But if Melissa's family was shocked by the accusations, Gary's was outraged.
Never, not one time in my life had I seen him lay a hand on her in any way.
In addition to the physical torture, Melissa claimed that Gary tormented her psychologically, too.
Gary totally controlled her.
She had to ask him to go to the bathroom. She had to ask him to take a shower.
According to Melissa, Gary would time her shopping trips, her showers, and even her bathroom trips, and if she was a minute late, he would track her down.
And why would Melissa endure such abuse? Her answer was twofold. First, she cited the abuse she had witnessed in her mother's relationships.
She was used to it. She didn't know the difference, I don't think, for a long time.
But most of all, Melissa said she had been afraid and ashamed.
You can be beat down so low that you tolerate to keep other people from knowing. You're ashamed of it. You try to protect the people around you from being abused because you don't know how far the abuser will go.
Melissa said that's why she had always gone back to Gary and why she had never told her family what was going on.
He always called her, he threatened her, and she did say that he threatened the family and that he threatened me.
But then, on the morning of November 2nd, 2009, Gary had threatened her one time too many.
She had already been through enough. She snapped.
And according to Melissa, all those years of abuse had ended that morning with a single gunshot to the back of his head.
She told me, Mom, I've been in prison all my life. Now I'm free.
But would her horrifying tale of abuse be enough to keep her free? In closing arguments, the prosecution scrambled to counter Melissa's claims.
Prior instances of abuse were not reported to law enforcement. She did not seek medical treatment for them. And essentially, they were solely coming from her.
Her son certainly hadn't mentioned witnessing any abuse in his testimony.
He's a smart kid. And if anything had been going on, I'm sure he would have heard it.
You got bruises, you got cuts, you got injuries. Kids are going to see.
And if Gary had been abusing her for all those years, wouldn't that give her grounds to gain custody of their child? Why wait to mention it until she was on trial for murder?
The typical citizen would pick up the phone and call, I've just shot my husband. He's been abusing me for 2, 4, 5, 6 years. I couldn't take it anymore.
Even more puzzling, according to the prosecutors, was the fact that Gary had filed for divorce. A divorce that was due to finalize in little more than a week. If Melissa was so desperate to escape her abusive husband, all she had to do was wait.
It wasn't like she didn't have a way out. She had a way out coming up in 8 days.
Coming up, Melissa faces the jury.
Missy turned around and looked at me and winked.
And Gary's family hopes for justice.
He can't be replaced.
On October 7, 2010, Melissa Cole sat in a McNairy County, Tennessee courtroom, awaiting the verdict in her murder trial. The 42-year-old was accused of shooting her husband Gary in the head and setting their home on fire in an effort to cover up the crime.
She was indicted for premeditated first-degree murder, aggravated arson, and 2 counts of tampering with evidence.
At trial, Melissa had admitted to shooting Gary, but had also claimed that she was a battered woman.
It's hard to say what the jury made of her claims of abuse.
Melissa, for one, appeared confident of an acquittal.
Missy turned around, looked at me and winked, smiled at me.
But Melissa's smile faded seconds later when the jury foreperson announced they had found her guilty of murder. However, the jury wasn't convinced that the murder had been premeditated.
The jury found her guilty of the lesser included offense of second-degree murder.
The jury also found Melissa guilty of arson and tampering with evidence. And on October 28th, the judge sentenced her to a total of 25 years in prison.
21 years on the second-degree murder and 4 years consecutive to that for the arson.
For Gary's family, 25 years felt like far too little in exchange for a man's life.
He can't be replaced. You know, he's irreplaceable. He's priceless to me. The things that we used to do, I can't do with him anymore. And she took him away from me.
Melissa's family, meanwhile, was just as devastated. In their minds, Gary was abusive and justice was denied.
I don't think Missy woke up and said, I'm going to kill Gary today. She was provoked.
She shouldn't be punished the way she is.
Although even in prison, Melissa hasn't given up hope.
She's got her GED. She's taking courses now, computers and business courses. So she'd be prepared to take care of herself.
And most of all, she wants to be prepared to tell her story. A story that she maintains is a cautionary tale about abuse.
She wants to help other women to understand they don't have to live like that, not to go to the lengths she went to.
In the summer of 1934, Brighton was supposed to be a place people escaped to, a glittering seaside resort on the southern coast of England, filled with crowded beaches, dance halls glowing late into the evening, and cafes packed with tourists escaping the grime and anxiety of industrial cities. On warm afternoons, couples walked arm in arm along the promenade while orchestras played behind open windows overlooking the sea. Holidaymakers arrived by train, carrying leather suitcases, beach clothes, and expectations of a peaceful weekend beside the water. Brighton had long been known as the Queen of Watering Places, a nickname that reflected elegance, leisure, and wealth. It was a city people associated with fresh sea air and summer romance. But in June of that year, something changed. Something so disturbing that newspapers across Britain twisted Brighton's famous title into. Something darker. They began calling it the Queen of Slaughtering Places. The phrase sounded theatrical, almost exaggerated at first glance. But within days, the city would earn that horrifying name. Because hidden among the noise of arriving trains and the laughter of tourists was the smell of death. And inside a forgotten trunk at Brighton Railway Station rested the remains of a woman nobody could identify. The discovery began quietly, not with screams, not with violence in the street, but with a smell. The kind of smell impossible to ignore once it reaches the back of your throat. Sour, heavy, sweet in the most unnatural way. The smell of decomposition. On June 17th, 1934, a railway employee named William Vinicum was carrying out routine duties inside the left luggage department at Brighton Station. The station itself was busy that day, as it usually was during the summer season. Passengers moved constantly through the platforms. Porters loaded baggage carts. Steam drifted through the air as locomotives arrived from London. In the middle of all that ordinary movement sat an abandoned wooden trunk. At first, it did not attract immediate attention. Forgotten luggage was common enough in a city filled with travelers. But this trunk had been sitting untouched for too long. And worse than that, the odor surrounding it had become unbearable. Vinicum reportedly noticed the smell becoming stronger as time passed. Employees nearby began complaining. Some assumed spoiled food had been left inside. Others suspected a dead animal. But eventually the stench became impossible to dismiss as something harmless. Police were called to examine the trunk. Even before it was opened, there was already tension in the room. The officers understood that decomposition carried a very particular smell, one that lingered, one that experienced policemen recognized instantly. The trunk itself was heavy, awkward, and suspiciously secured. Witnesses later described a strange silence settling over the luggage room as officers prepared to force it open. Outside, trains continued arriving. Brighton continued moving as if nothing had happened. But inside that room, several men stood frozen around an object that would soon become infamous across Britain. When the trunk was finally opened, the scene inside was so horrifying that even hardened investigators reportedly struggled to process what they were seeing. Inside the wooden container was the mutilated torso of a young woman. Her body had been dismembered. The remains were already decomposing. Most disturbing of all, the head and hand were missing completely. Whoever had placed her there had not simply killed her. They had taken deliberate steps to erase her identity. In 1934, that mattered enormously. Without a head, detail identification became impossible. Without hands, fingerprints could not be taken. The mutilation suggested calculation, method, an understanding, whether sophisticated or instinctive, of how difficult identification would become. Once those parts were removed, police immediately sealed off the area. Railway staff were questioned. Detectives attempted to determine how long the trunk had been there and who might have transported it into the station. But the environment itself complicated everything. Brighton Station processed enormous numbers of travelers. Suitcases and trunks moved constantly through its corridors. A single abandoned piece of luggage could disappear into the rhythm of the station without attracting much notice. And that was exactly what appeared to have happened. News of the discovery spread rapidly. By evening, newspapers across the country were already publishing sensational headlines about the trunk murder. Journalists described Brighton as a city transformed overnight from fashionable resort town into a landscape of fear. The brutality of the crime shocked the public not only because of the mutilation itself, but because of where it occurred. Railway stations symbolized movement, connection, modernity. Thousands of ordinary people passed through them daily. The idea that a human body could be hidden in luggage and transported through England without detection terrified people. Suddenly, every unattended suitcase seemed suspicious. Every unfamiliar traveler became a possible threat. But the horror was only beginning. The following day, investigators received another shocking discovery. At King's Cross Station in London, railway workers found a suitcase containing 2 severed legs. Examination quickly confirmed that the remains belonged to the same victim discovered in Brighton. The realization deepened the mystery dramatically. This was no impulsive act of violence hidden in panic. The body had been separated, transported, and distributed across railway routes between Brighton and London. The killer had moved through public transportation systems carrying human remains while surrounded by ordinary passengers, men reading newspapers, women traveling with children, tourists returning from a coast. The contrast between normal life and hidden horror disturbed investigators profoundly. Yet despite the additional discovery, the most important pieces remained missing. The victim's head was never found. Neither were her hands. And without them, police faced a devastating problem. They did not know who she was. Detectives worked urgently to reconstruct some understanding of the victim from the remains available. The woman appeared young. Her body suggested she had been reasonably well cared for physically. There were no obvious identifying marks available. No clothing that clearly established identity. No witnesses who recognized her description immediately. As details leaked to the press, public fascination intensified. Crowds gathered outside newspaper offices waiting for updates. Rumors spread through Brighton cafes and London pubs. Some believed the killer must be a butcher or doctor because of the dismemberment. Others whispered about organized criminal networks. There were even fears that a serial killer might be operating between London and the southern coast. But underneath the sensationalism was something more unsettling: complete uncertainty. Police had no clear suspect, no confirmed timeline, no reliable understanding of where the victim had died, and no name. The lack of identity transformed the victim into something hauntingly symbolic. She became a ghost at the center of a national obsession. The newspapers eventually gave her a nickname that would endure for decades: the girl with the pretty feet. The description came from observations about the victim's feet after the legs were discovered. Journalists described them as unusually elegant and delicate, almost like those of a dancer. In another era, perhaps such language would have sounded poetic. But within the context of the case, it carried a tragic cruelty. A young woman had been reduced to fragments, and the public knew her only through one isolated physical characteristic. Her face was gone, her voice gone, her name erased. She existed in the newspapers as an anonymous body reconstructed through partial remains. Yet strangely, that nickname made the mystery even more powerful in the public imagination. People wanted to know who she had been. They searched missing person notices obsessively. Families across Britain feared the unidentified woman might be their daughter, sister, or friend. Detectives faced overwhelming pressure. Every day that passed without identification increased public panic and embarrassment for the police. Investigators began tracing railway routes, attempting to determine where the trunk may have originated. But rail systems in the 1930s created enormous challenges. Luggage moved through multiple stations with limited oversight. Travelers frequently used aliases. Surveillance technology did not exist. A killer with patience and composure could disappear into the flow of passengers almost effortlessly. And so detectives found themselves confronting a terrifying possibility. The murderer may have planned every aspect of the concealment specifically to exploit those weaknesses. The mutilation suggested deliberation. The use of railway luggage systems suggested confidence. Whoever committed the crime had either remained remarkably calm after the killing or possessed enough experience to avoid panic altogether. Meanwhile, Brighton itself began changing under the weight of fear and media attention. Tourists continued arriving, but conversations had shifted. In restaurants and hotels, people discussed the trunk murder constantly. Some residents avoided the railway station entirely. Others became fascinated by the investigation, following every rumor printed in newspapers. Reporters flooded the city, searching for witnesses and scandal. Brighton's glamorous image began collapsing beneath the shadow of the case. And then came an even more disturbing realization. Detectives investigating the unidentified woman would soon stumble into another trunk murder. Entirely. Another dead woman. Another concealed body. Another story of violence hidden behind the crowded facades of Brighton nightlife. But at this stage, nobody understood that yet. For the moment, all attention remained focused on the unknown young woman whose remains had traveled between stations in silence. The woman without a face, without hands, without a name. A victim whose final journey through England had unfolded inside ordinary luggage while the world around her carried on completely unaware. And as investigators searched desperately for answers, one terrifying possibility lingered in the minds of both police and public alike. If someone could commit a crime this brutal, this methodical, and disappear so completely afterward, then perhaps the killer was still walking freely through Brighton, unnoticed among the holiday crowds. The most unsettling murders are often the ones where the victims begin disappearing long before. their deaths are discovered. Sometimes society loses sight of a person gradually, in pieces through poverty, isolation, dangerous relationships, or the quiet invisibility imposed on certain kinds of women. By the time investigators arrive, the victim has already been reduced by the world around them into rumor, stereotype, or silence. And in the Brighton trunk murders, that silence became one of the defining features of the entire case. Because before detectives could find a killer, they first had to answer a simpler and somehow more tragic question. Who were these women? The unidentified young woman found inside the trunk at Brighton Station became known to the public through fragments. A torso discovered in one city, legs discovered in another. No face, no fingerprints, no name. She entered British criminal history not as a complete person, but as a mystery assembled from scattered remains and newspaper speculation. Yet investigators still attempted to reconstruct her life from the limited evidence available. One of the central figures in that effort was the famous British pathologist Bernard Spilsbury. By 1934, Spilsbury was already one of the most recognizable forensic experts in Britain. His testimony had shaped some of the country's most notorious murder trials. Calm, methodical, and highly respected, he represented the emerging authority of modern forensic science during a period when criminal investigation was rapidly evolving but still deeply limited by the technology of the era. When Spilsbury examined the remains recovered from Brighton and King's Cross, he was able to establish several important details about the victim. She was believed to be between 21 and 28 years old, approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall. Her body suggested she had been reasonably well nourished and cared for physically. Perhaps most significant of all, she was around 5 months pregnant at the time of her death. That revelation altered the emotional gravity of the case immediately. The public was no longer confronting only the murder of an unidentified woman. There was also an unborn child. 2 lives extinguished together. In 1930s Britain, pregnancy outside marriage carried enormous social consequences. Women who became pregnant under difficult circumstances often faced shame, financial desperation, and isolation. Opportunities for support were limited, particularly for women living on the margins of society. Illegal abortions existed in dangerous underground networks because legal medical options were unavailable. Women sometimes disappeared quietly into boarding houses, temporary rooms, or back-alley operations where secrecy mattered more than safety. Investigators understood all of this, and as details about the pregnancy emerged, detectives began considering whether the victim may have been connected to that hidden world. But even with Spilsbury's examination, the investigation remained crippled by the missing parts of the body. The absence of the head and hands was not simply gruesome. It was strategically devastating. In modern investigations, DNA databases, digital records, and advanced forensic systems can sometimes identify victims even from limited remains. But in 1934, identification relied heavily on physical recognition. Faces, dental records, fingerprints. Remove those elements, and a victim could effectively vanish from official systems. That reality deeply disturbed investigators because it suggested intentionality. Whoever dismembered the body may have understood exactly what they were doing. The killer had not merely hidden a corpse. They had attacked the victim's identity itself. Police circulated descriptions nationwide. They examined missing person reports. Families came forward fearing the unidentified woman could be someone they loved. But none of the cases matched conclusively. Some women resembled the estimated age range. Others matched height or physical build. But without definitive identification, every lead eventually collapsed into uncertainty. Meanwhile, newspapers transformed the victim into a public obsession. And it was the press that gave her the nickname history would remember: the girl with the pretty feet. The phrase emerged after the recovery of the victim's legs at King's Cross Station. Reports described her feet as unusually elegant and delicate, almost graceful enough to resemble those of a ballet dancer. The nickname spread rapidly through headlines and conversation. It sounded strangely poetic beside the brutality of the crime, and perhaps that contrast made it unforgettable. Yet underneath the sensationalism was something profoundly sad. The public knew almost nothing about the woman herself, not her ambitions, not her relationships, not the sound of her voice or the details of her ordinary life. Her identity had been reduced to a single physical observation because everything else had been taken away. There is a disturbing pattern throughout criminal history in the treatment of unidentified female victims. Society often turns them into symbols instead of people. Their stories become wrapped in mystery while their humanity fades into the background. In Brighton, newspapers speculated endlessly about who the young woman might have been. Some imagined she was wealthy because she appeared well cared for physically. Others theorized she may have been connected to entertainment or dance because of the appearance of her feet. But none of it brought investigators closer to the truth. And while the public focused on the mystery, detectives faced another painful reality. Somewhere, someone may have been searching for her without knowing what had happened. A mother waiting for a letter that never arrived. Friends assuming she had left town. A family afraid to contact police because of shame surrounding pregnancy. Every unidentified victim leaves behind invisible circles of uncertainty. People trapped between hope and dread. In this case, those circles never fully closed, because the young woman was never identified. Even today, decades later, she remains one of Britain's most haunting unidentified murder victims. But while police struggled with the mystery of the unknown woman, another life connected to the Brighton trunk murders was already moving toward catastrophe. Unlike the first victim, this woman had a name. She had a history, people who knew her, places where she had laughed and argued and survived. Her name was Violette Kay. Violette was 42 years old in 1934. She had once worked as a dancer and later supported herself through sex work in London. Like many women living at the edges of economic survival during that period, her life was shaped by instability. The Great Depression had left deep scars across Britain. Employment was uncertain, housing could be temporary, and women without financial protection often depended on precarious relationships to survive. Brighton itself attracted many transient residents, entertainers, laborers, tourists, drifters, and sex workers moved constantly between London and the coast. People arrived under aliases. Some disappeared without immediate notice. In that environment, vulnerability could become almost invisible. Violette's relationship with a younger man named Tony Mancini would eventually place her at the center of one of Britain's most controversial murder trials. Mancini already carried a reputation for criminal behavior. He had prior convictions involving theft and violence, and reportedly used multiple aliases. Throughout his life, accounts surrounding him often described instability, aggression, and manipulation. Yet relationships like theirs were not unusual within the nightlife environments of London and Brighton during the era. People surviving on society's margins frequently formed intense, volatile bonds shaped by dependency, jealousy, money, and fear of abandonment. What survives in historical records suggests that Violette and Mancini's relationship was turbulent. Arguments were not uncommon. Alcohol appears to have played a role in many of their conflicts. Witnesses later recalled tension between them, particularly involving accusations of infidelity. The emotional volatility surrounding the relationship would become critically important after Violette disappeared. To understand the atmosphere surrounding her final weeks, it helps to understand Brighton itself in the 1930s. The city existed in two forms simultaneously. By daylight, it presented elegance. Hotels overlooking the sea, crowded cafes, Music drifting through open windows. Vacationers strolling the promenade beneath summer sunlight. But after dark, another Brighton emerged. One built around bars, dance halls, gambling rooms, and transient nightlife. A place where alcohol blurred judgment and identities shifted easily. Where people arrived without history and sometimes vanished without immediate consequence. Women like Violette occupied a particularly vulnerable position in that world. Society depended on their invisibility while simultaneously condemning them for it. If they disappeared, investigations could move slowly. Their personal lives were often scrutinized more harshly than those of the men around them. During the later trial, Violette's profession and lifestyle would repeatedly become subjects of courtroom discussion, illustrating how easily female victims could be reframed through moral judgment rather than empathy. Yet behind those labels was still a human being, a woman who had grown older in a difficult profession, a woman trying to survive economically during unstable times, a woman whose final days would soon become intertwined with one of the most disturbing concealment cases in British criminal history. The last confirmed public sighting of Violette would occur during a violent argument at the Skylar Cafe in Brighton on May 10, 1934. Witnesses described heavy drinking, jealousy, and accusations directed at Mancini involving another young waitress. The confrontation appeared emotionally charged and humiliating. But at the time, nobody witnessing the argument could have understood its significance. Couples fought publicly in cafes all the time, especially in nightlife districts shaped by alcohol and unstable relationships. What made this moment horrifying in retrospect was not simply the argument itself, but the silence that followed afterward. Because after that night, nobody would ever see Violette K alive again. And as investigators struggled to identify one dead woman without a name, another woman's disappearance was already slipping quietly beneath the surface of Brighton's crowded summer streets. One of the most difficult realities in historical true crime is accepting how much remains unknowable. Modern audiences often expect investigations to provide complete narratives, a motive, a timeline, a confession, a final explanation that neatly organizes horror into something understandable. But many real cases do not offer that comfort. Some crimes survive only through fragments, partial testimony, incomplete forensic evidence, contradictory accounts, and unanswered questions buried beneath decades of speculation. The Brighton trunk murders exist inside that uncertainty. 2 women, 2 trunks, one city overwhelmed by fear. Yet the events themselves remain partly obscured, as though history preserved only flashes of light inside an otherwise darkened room. For the unidentified young woman, known only as the girl with the pretty feet, investigators never reconstructed a full account of her final hours. There were no surviving witnesses describing her movements immediately before death. No confirmed location where she was killed. No established timeline tracing her journey into Brighton's railway system. The absence of her identity created an almost impenetrable barrier around the entire crime. Detectives could analyze the body, the luggage, and the railway routes. But without understanding who she was, they struggled to understand why she had been targeted. What investigators didn't know was disturbing enough. The woman had been approximately 5 months pregnant. Her body had been carefully mutilated. The head and hands had been removed and never recovered. The remains were divided between Brighton Station and King's Cross Station in London. Each detail suggested deliberate concealment rather than chaotic violence. This was not a body abandoned impulsively in panic after an accidental death. Someone had transported human remains across public railway lines with enough control to avoid immediate detection. And as public pressure mounted, detectives began exploring one of the most controversial theories connected to the case: the possibility that the victim had died during or after an illegal abortion. To understand why investigators considered this theory seriously, it is necessary to understand the social climate of Britain in the 1930s. Abortion was illegal. Women facing unwanted pregnancies often had extremely limited options, particularly if they lacked financial support or feared public disgrace. Underground abortion networks existed across major cities, frequently operating in unsafe conditions with little medical oversight. Some women died during these procedures. Others disappeared quietly because families feared scandal or authorities feared public embarrassment. Detectives investigating the Brighton trunk case knew this hidden world existed, and several aspects of the victim's condition appeared, at least initially, to point toward it. She was pregnant. Her body had been dismembered. Her identity appeared intentionally erased. Investigators wondered whether someone involved in an illegal medical procedure might have attempted to conceal a death by disposing of the body in pieces. Suspicion eventually focused on a man named Dr. Messiah, who reportedly had prior associations with allegations involving women dying after illegal abortions. In the atmosphere of fear and sensational reporting surrounding the case, public imagination seized upon the theory quickly. Newspapers speculated about secret clinics, desperate women, and criminal cover-ups hidden behind respectable doors. The image was terrifying because it reflected genuine social anxieties of the era. Many women lived dangerously close to systems willing to exploit their vulnerability in silence. But despite the growing speculation, investigators could never establish a definitive connection between Messiah and the unidentified victim. Bernard Spilsbury's forensic examination reportedly found no evidence proving a failed abortion had cause or death. No witness placed her with Messiah. No physical evidence connected him directly to the remains. Gradually, the theory weakened under scrutiny. Detectives found themselves trapped again in the same suffocating uncertainty. A dead woman without a name, transported in luggage across railway stations, with no clear explanation for how or why she had died. The investigation stalled. Leads collapsed one after another. And while police remained consumed by the unidentified victim, another tragedy was unfolding much closer to them than they realized. Unlike the first victim, the final days of Violette K. can be reconstructed more clearly because witnesses remembered seeing her alive shortly before she vanished. Her relationship with Tony Mancini had already become volatile by the spring of 1934. Witness accounts described frequent arguments fueled by jealousy, alcohol, and suspicion. Brighton's nightlife environment intensified those tensions. Cafes and bars remained crowded late into the evening, and emotional confrontations often played out publicly in front of strangers who quickly forgot what they had seen. But one particular argument would later become central to the investigation. On May 10, 1934, Violette and Mancini were seen together at the Skylark Cafe near Brighton seafront. Reports described Violette as heavily intoxicated. Witnesses later recalled a loud and emotionally charged confrontation between the couple. According to accounts presented later, Violette accused Mancini of being involved with a teenage waitress. The argument reportedly escalated into shouting and humiliation in front of others inside the cafe. To outsiders, it may have appeared like another drunken relationship dispute among many common in nightlife districts. But retrospect changes ordinary moments into warning signs. Knowing what followed afterward transforms the scene completely. This would become the last confirmed occasion on which Violette K. was seen alive. After the argument, she disappeared. At first, the disappearance did not immediately trigger alarm. That detail reflects another painful truth about vulnerable women during that era. Women involved in transient lifestyles or sex work could vanish temporarily without provoking urgent investigations. Friends assumed travel. Employers assumed personal problems. Acquaintances drifted in and out of cities constantly. This appearance did not always appear unusual right away. Mancini exploited that uncertainty skillfully. According to later investigation records, he began constructing explanations for Violette's absence almost immediately. He claimed she had gone to Paris. He reportedly distributed some of her clothing to others, reinforcing the impression that she had left voluntarily. Most disturbingly, he even sent telegrams forged in her name to mislead family members and acquaintances. The deception was not sophisticated in a modern forensic sense, but it was psychologically effective. It created confusion rather than certainty. People hesitated. Some doubted their suspicions. Others wanted to believe the simplest explanation, that Violette had simply chosen to leave. Meanwhile, according to investigators, her body remained horrifyingly close. What happened next became one of the most disturbing concealment episodes in British criminal history. After Violette's death, Mancini reportedly transported her body inside a trunk to lodgings on Kemp Street in Brighton. Witnesses later described him moving a large trunk through the area using a handcart. At the time, nothing about the site necessarily appeared suspicious. Brighton was filled with luggage, boxes, and travelers moving possessions between boarding houses. That normality is part of what makes the story so disturbing. Hidden inside an ordinary trunk moving through public streets was a dead woman. Once inside the Kemp Street room, investigators later concluded that Mancini kept the trunk containing Violette's body beneath the bed. Some accounts described him placing a cloth over it and effectively using it as a table while visitors entered the room unaware of what sat only feet away from them. The image became infamous because it reflected something psychologically difficult to comprehend: the ability to continue ordinary life beside concealed death. Witnesses later described an unbearable smell inside the room. Some reportedly noticed fluid leaking from the trunk. Yet despite growing suspicion and obvious decomposition, Mancini continued living in the space with the body present. This detail horrified the British public perhaps even more than the murder itself. Violence committed in sudden rage was terrifying enough, but the prolonged concealment suggested emotional detachment so extreme that newspapers portrayed Mancini almost as inhuman. Still, even here, the exact circumstances of Violette's death remained uncertain during the initial investigation. There had been no eyewitness to the killing itself, no confession at that stage, only circumstantial evidence surrounding concealment and deception. And while Mancini attempted to maintain the illusion that Violette had left Brighton voluntarily, pressure slowly intensified around him. The smell from the room became increasingly difficult to explain. Questions continued. Police attention toward trunk-related crimes in Brighton had become unusually heightened because of the unidentified woman discovered at the railway station. Ironically, investigators searching for answers in one trunk murder were moving steadily closer to another. Eventually, police discovered the trunk containing Violette's body during inquiries connected to the broader panic surrounding the Brighton trunk cases. The moment investigators realized they were confronting a second concealed corpse must have felt surreal. Brighton had already become consumed by fear over the unidentified pregnant woman. Now another dead woman had emerged from another trunk in the same city within weeks. The public immediately wondered whether the crimes were connected. Had a serial killer begun operating in Brighton? Were investigators confronting a single murder responsible for multiple dismemberments and concealed bodies? Even police were uncertain, but there were important differences between the cases. Violette's body had not been dismembered in the same manner. Her identity was known, and suspicion rapidly centered on one specific individual: Tony Mancini. Once investigators began closing in, Mancini fled Brighton and traveled to London. To police and the public, the flight appeared deeply incriminating. Newspapers portrayed him as a violent criminal attempting escape after discovery of the body. Yet, even then, significant legal questions remained unresolved. Had he murdered Violette intentionally? Had there been a fight that escalated unexpectedly? Could prosecutors prove exactly what occurred inside the room where she died? Those uncertainties would soon dominate one of Britain's most sensational murder trials. But before the courtroom drama, before the acquittal, before the later confession that would haunt the case for decades, Brighton itself remained trapped inside a growing atmosphere of fear. 2 trunks, 2 women, one unidentified and effectively erased from history, another hidden beneath a bed while life continued around her. The city's glamorous facade had collapsed completely by then. Behind the music halls and seaside cafes was something darker, a realization that violence could exist quietly beside ordinary life, concealed inside luggage, hidden in rented rooms, carried unnoticed through crowded streets, while everyone else continued believing they were safe. By the summer of 1934, Brighton police were no longer dealing with a single horrifying discovery. They were confronting something far more destabilizing: the possibility that their city had become the center of a pattern of concealed violence they did not yet understand. Public anxiety intensified with every newspaper headline. Railway stations, boarding houses, cafes, and narrow seaside streets all became charged with suspicion. Detectives faced immense pressure not only to identify a killer, but to restore a sense of order to a city increasingly associated with mutilation, hidden corpses, and unanswered questions. Yet the investigation itself unfolded inside a world that lacked many of the forensic tools modern audiences now take for granted. No DNA profiling existed. National missing person databases were fragmented or non-existent. Communication between police jurisdictions could be slow and inconsistent. Surveillance cameras did not exist. Investigators relied heavily on witness memory, physical observation, handwritten records, and instinct. And in the Brighton trunk murders, those limitations shaped every stage of the inquiry. The investigation into the unidentified young woman the victim newspapers had named the girl with the pretty feet began with the difficult task of tracing the trunk itself. Detectives examined railway systems carefully, attempting to determine where the luggage may have originated and how it moved between stations. But rail travel in 1930s Britain created enormous investigative complications. Trunks and suitcases passed through countless hands each day. Passengers traveled anonymously. Luggage records were inconsistent. A person carrying a heavy trunk through a crowded station could easily avoid notice simply by appearing confident and ordinary. Detectives attempted to reconstruct timelines based on luggage storage records and station observations. But those efforts produced few definitive answers. The trunk found at Brighton Station had not immediately appeared suspicious because forgotten. Baggage was common in busy transport hubs. By the time police recognized the significance of the odor coming from the container, crucial opportunities for tracing its movements had already been lost. Investigators next turned toward public appeals. Newspapers across Britain published descriptions of the unidentified victim. Authorities focused especially on the fact that she had been pregnant. Detectives hoped relatives, employers, or acquaintances might recognize details matching a missing woman between the ages of 21 and 28. Reports described her approximate height, physical condition, and a now famous characterization of her feet. But the appeals generated confusion as much as clarity. Numerous families contacted police fearing the victim might be someone they knew. Women who had disappeared voluntarily were suddenly treated as possible murder victims. Some leads appeared promising briefly before collapsing under scrutiny. Others revealed painful social realities of the time: estranged families, hidden pregnancies, unstable housing situations, and women living lives partially disconnected from official systems. Detectives found themselves overwhelmed by uncertainty. The absence of the victim's head and hands remained the investigation's greatest obstacle. Bernard Spilsbury's forensic work could establish certain physical facts, but could not restore the identity deliberately stripped away from the body. Investigators increasingly suspected the mutilation had been designed specifically to frustrate police efforts. If true, that suggested the killer possessed either unusual composure or prior familiarity with investigative methods. The possibility deeply unsettled authorities. Newspapers amplified those fears relentlessly. Public fascination with the case became almost obsessive. The image of body parts transported between railway stations struck directly at British anxieties about modern urban life. Railways symbolized national connection and routine movement. The idea that a murderer had used those same systems to conceal human remains transformed ordinary travel into something sinister. Reports describe passengers glancing nervously at unattended luggage. Railway workers became more alert to suspicious baggage. Brighton itself struggled beneath growing reputational damage as journalists flooded the city, searching for scandal and speculation. Meanwhile, investigators explored the theory involving illegal abortion networks and a man known as Dr. Messiah. Detectives examined whether the unidentified victim may have died during a clandestine medical procedure. The theory gained traction because it appeared to explain several elements simultaneously: the pregnancy, the concealment, and the mutilation. But despite public speculation, police failed to establish any direct evidentiary connection. There was no proof Messiah had treated the victim. No witness identified her. No forensic evidence confirmed a failed abortion procedure. Gradually, investigators were forced to acknowledge that the theory remained speculation rather than proof. That realization brought frustration bordering on despair for some involved in the case. Every investigative path seemed to end in uncertainty. The unidentified woman remained unidentified. The killer remained unknown, and the public's fear continued growing. Some investigators reportedly worried they might be confronting a repeat offender capable of killing again. Then, in the middle of that escalating panic, the investigation took a dramatic and unexpected turn. While police remained heavily focused on the railway trunk case, attention around Brighton had become unusually heightened towards suspicious luggage and concealed spaces. Officers were conducting broader inquiries connected to trunks, rented rooms, and unusual activity near transport routes. It was during this atmosphere of intensified scrutiny that investigators discovered another horrifying secret hidden within the city. At a property on Kemp Street, police uncovered a trunk containing the decomposing body of Violette K. The discovery changed the entire landscape of the investigation almost instantly. Brighton was no longer dealing with a single mysterious trunk murder. Now there were two dead women connected by the same chilling method of concealment. Public speculation exploded immediately. Newspapers questioned whether a serial killer might be operating in Brighton. Some articles implied the city itself had become infected with hidden violence. Detectives, however, recognized important differences between the cases even while uncertainty remained. Unlike the unidentified young woman, Violette had not been mutilated in the same manner. Her body had been concealed inside a trunk, but not dismembered. More importantly, investigators quickly identified a likely suspect connected directly to her disappearance: Tony Mancini. Once detectives learned of Violette's relationship with Mancini, the investigation accelerated rapidly. Witnesses described the couple's volatile arguments. Authorities discovered that Violette had not been seen alive since the confrontation at the Skylark Cafe on May 10th. Investigators also uncovered evidence suggesting Mancini had actively attempted to create the illusion that Violette left Brighton voluntarily. Reports indicated he told acquaintances she had gone to Paris. He distributed some of her belongings. Telegrams had reportedly been sent under her name. To detectives, the pattern looked less like confusion and more like deliberate deception. The discovery of the body intensified suspicion dramatically. Witnesses described the unbearable smell in the Kemp Street room where Mancini had reportedly lived, alongside the concealed corpse. Some accounts spoke of fluid leaking from the trunk itself. The psychological impact on investigators must have been profound. Concealment after death is disturbing enough. But continuing daily life in close proximity to a decomposing body introduced a level of emotional detachment that many observers found almost incomprehensible. Police also learned that Mancini had transported the trunk through public streets using a handcart. That detail echoed the broader fears already haunting Brighton after the railway trunk discoveries. Once again, a concealed body had moved openly through ordinary urban life without immediate detection. But unlike the unidentified victim's case, investigators now possessed something concrete. A suspect whose actions appeared deeply suspicious before and after the death. When Mancini fled Brighton following discovery of the body, police interpreted the move as further evidence of guilt. Flight has long carried strong psychological weight in criminal investigations. To authorities and much of the public, an innocent man would have no reason to disappear. Mancini's departure for London, therefore, intensified the growing perception that police had finally found at least one of the people responsible for Brighton's horrors. His arrest became national news. Newspapers portrayed him as violent, deceptive, and morally corrupt. Headlines emphasized his criminal background and the grotesque details surrounding the concealed body. Yet behind the sensational coverage, investigators still faced important evidentiary problems. They could prove concealment more easily than murder itself. There had been no eyewitness to Violette's death. The prosecution would need to establish not only that Mancini hid the body, but that he intentionally killed her. And in the legal environment of the 1930s, those distinctions mattered enormously. Investigators began constructing a timeline around the final days before Violette vanished. Witness statements from the Skylar Cafe became central pieces of evidence. The argument involving jealousy and accusations of infidelity suggested motive and emotional instability within the relationship. Police also focused heavily on Mancini's post-disappearance behavior, the false explanations, the telegrams, the flight from Brighton, and the concealment of the corpse beneath the bed. To detectives, the overall picture appeared compelling. But defense lawyers would later argue that suspicion and certainty were not the same thing. One of the greatest challenges investigators faced involved forensic limitations. Medical experts could analyze injuries and decomposition, but establishing exact timelines remained difficult. The prosecution theory depended heavily on interpretation rather than definitive scientific proof. This weakness would later become crucial in court. Meanwhile, the unresolved mystery of the unidentified pregnant woman continued casting a shadow over the entire investigation. Police could not conclusively determine whether the two trunk murders were connected. The similarities were undeniable: female victims, concealed remains, trunks used for transport or storage, Brighton as the central location. But the differences also mattered. One victim had been dismembered and never identified. The other remained intact and linked directly to a known associate. Investigators worried constantly about making incorrect assumptions. If the crimes were connected, then perhaps the true killer remained free. If they were unrelated, Brighton had somehow become the site of two horrifying trunk-related deaths within weeks of each other, entirely by coincidence. Neither explanation felt reassuring. The The psychological toll on investigators likely grew heavier as the case expanded. Detectives working these murders were not confronting isolated violence hidden neatly behind closed doors. They were confronting crimes that invaded public imagination. Railway stations, boarding houses, trunks moved through crowded streets, anonymous victims, deception layered over concealment. Every element amplified fear because it suggested how easily horror could hide inside ordinary environments. By the time authorities prepared the case against Tony Mancini for trial, Britain had become captivated by the Brighton trunk murders. Newspapers followed every development obsessively. Public opinion increasingly hardened against Mancini long before he entered the courtroom. Yet beneath the certainty of headlines remained an uncomfortable truth investigators could never fully escape. One victim still had no name, one case still had no killer, and despite all the arrests and theories and public outrage, much of the darkness surrounding Brighton in 1934 remained unresolved. By the time Tony Mancini stood trial in 1934, the Brighton trunk murders had already become one of the most sensational criminal cases in Britain. Newspapers across the country followed every development with obsessive intensity. Crowds gathered outside court buildings hoping to glimpse the accused man whose name had become linked to concealed corpses. Deception, in one of the darkest periods in Brighton's history. Public fear had gradually transformed into something closer to morbid fascination. The case contained every element capable of dominating headlines. A glamorous seaside city corrupted by violence. An unidentified pregnant victim whose killer remained unknown. A second woman hidden inside a trunk beneath a bed. And a suspect whose behavior after the death appeared deeply disturbing. Yet despite the atmosphere of certainty developing in public opinion, the legal reality facing prosecutors was more complicated. Suspicion alone was not enough. Concealment of a body was horrifying, but the court still required proof of murder. And proving exactly what happened inside a private room weeks earlier would become far more difficult than many expected. The trial attracted extraordinary attention partly because it seemed to represent more than a single criminal proceeding. For many observers, the courtroom became a place where broader anxieties about morality, class, urban life, and violence converged. Brighton's reputation had collapsed beneath the weight of the trunk murders. Journalists described the city as a place where danger lurked beneath respectable appearances. Stories about railway luggage, boarding houses, and nightlife districts had already captured the national imagination. Now, the public wanted a conclusion, a clear villain, a definitive explanation capable of restoring order to an otherwise chaotic narrative. When Mancini entered court, many people already believed they knew exactly who he was. Newspapers emphasized his criminal history repeatedly. Reports described his previous involvement in theft and violence. His use of aliases reinforced the perception of dishonesty and instability. Most damaging of all was the horrifying image prosecutors intended to present. A man living in the same room as the decomposing body of his dead partner, concealed inside a trunk beneath the bed. Even before formal arguments began, that detail alone had shaped public perception almost irreversibly. But Mancini's defense would soon receive one of the most formidable advantages available in British legal circles. Representing him was Norman Burkett, one of the most respected defense barristers in the country. Burkett possessed a reputation for intelligence, composure, and persuasive courtroom strategy. He understood something crucial about high-profile murder trials. Public outrage often creates the illusion of certainty long before evidence actually supports it. His role would not be to make Mancini appear admirable. That would likely have been impossible given the surrounding facts. Instead, Burkett focused on a narrower and far more effective legal objective: creating reasonable doubt. The prosecution began by presenting a narrative of escalating domestic conflict leading to murder. Central to their case was the volatile relationship between Mancini and Violette K. Witness testimony regarding the argument at the Skylark Cafe became critical. Prosecutors emphasized reports of jealousy, alcohol, and accusations of infidelity. The confrontation painted a picture of emotional instability capable of erupting into violence. According to the prosecution theory, Violette disappeared after that argument because Mancini killed her shortly afterward. The concealment of the body then became part of a deliberate attempt to escape responsibility. Prosecutors highlighted the false claims that Violette had gone to Paris. They described the forged telegrams sent in her name. They pointed to the distribution of her clothing and Mancini's eventual flight to London after. Discovery of the body. Each detail, they argued, demonstrated consciousness of guilt. Innocent men do not hide corpses beneath beds. Innocent men do not invent stories about dead women traveling abroad. Innocent men do not flee when police begin asking questions. The prosecution's argument carried emotional force because many aspects of the case seemed intuitively incriminating. Jurors heard testimony about the unbearable smell inside the Kemp Street room. Witnesses described fluid leaking from the trunk. The concealment itself appeared grotesque beyond ordinary comprehension. Even people attempting objectivity likely struggled emotionally with the image of a decomposing body, hidden beneath furniture while daily life continued around it. But criminal trials do not operate solely on emotional reactions. And this was where Norman Burkett's defense strategy became extraordinarily important. Rather than attempting to deny the concealment, Burkett focused relentlessly on uncertainty surrounding the actual death itself. He attacked the prosecution's ability to prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. Yes, Mancini had hidden the body. Yes, he had lied afterward. But according to the defense, those facts alone did not conclusively establish intentional killing. Burkett reportedly challenged forensic interpretations aggressively. Medical science in 1934 lacked the precision modern juries often expect from homicide. Investigations. Establishing exact timelines remained difficult. Reconstructing the precise circumstances of death proved even harder. The defense exploited every ambiguity available. Could prosecutors prove exactly when Violette died? Could they establish with certainty how the fatal injury occurred? Was there definitive evidence disproving an accident or struggle that escalated unexpectedly? Burkett understood that reasonable doubt does not require proving innocence. It only requires weakening certainty. The defense also reframed Violette's lifestyle in ways that remain uncomfortable to examine today. Like many historical murder trials involving vulnerable women, aspects of the victim's profession and personal life became tools within the courtroom battle itself. Burkett suggested alternative possibilities involving dangerous acquaintances or clients connected to her work. By emphasizing the instability and complexity of her social environment, the defense attempted to widen the field of possible explanations. Modern audiences may recognize how such strategies often shifted scrutiny away from defendants and onto victims themselves. Yet during the 1930s, these arguments could carry substantial influence with juries shaped by prevailing social prejudices. Another key element of the defense involved psychological interpretation of Mancini's behavior after the death. Burkett reportedly argued that panic and concealment did not automatically prove murder. A frightened man, confronted with a sudden death under compromising circumstances, might irrationally hide a body out of fear. The argument was morally disturbing, but legally effective because it separated concealment from intent. Jurors were asked to consider whether Mancini's grotesque actions after Violette's death necessarily proved he had deliberately killed her. Inside the courtroom, tension reportedly remained intense throughout proceedings. The Brighton Trunk murders had already become deeply embedded in public consciousness. Every testimony carried symbolic weight beyond the individual case itself. Journalists filled newspapers with descriptions of courtroom reactions, witness statements, and legal arguments. Britain watched closely because the trial appeared to offer a chance for resolution after months of fear and uncertainty. Yet beneath the dramatic atmosphere, the prosecution continued struggling with one fundamental problem. There was no eyewitness to the killing. No confession existed at that stage. Much of the case depended on interpretation of circumstantial evidence. And while circumstantial cases can absolutely secure convictions, they become vulnerable when skilled defense attorneys successfully introduce alternative explanations. The unresolved mystery of the unidentified pregnant woman also lingered over proceedings indirectly. Public imagination had fused the Trunk murders together, even if investigators remained uncertain about any direct connection. That broader atmosphere of horror may have intensified emotional pressure surrounding the trial. But courts ultimately required specificity rather than atmosphere. The jury's responsibility was not to solve every fear haunting Brighton. It was to determine whether the prosecution had proven beyond reasonable doubt that Tony Mancini murdered Violette K. After closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. Outside the courtroom, speculation intensified. Many observers expected conviction. Public sentiment had turned heavily against Mancini long before the trial concluded. Yet juries can react unpredictably when confronted directly with uncertainty inside legal standards. After approximately 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. Not guilty. The acquittal shocked much of Britain. Newspapers described scenes of disbelief and outrage. To many observers, the verdict felt incomprehensible given the concealment of the body and the extensive deception afterward. Critics questioned whether the defense had manipulated technical uncertainty successfully despite overwhelming circumstantial suspicion. Others defended the verdict as an example of the legal system functioning correctly under the principle that suspicion alone cannot replace proof. The acquittal also reflected the extraordinary effectiveness of Norman Burkett's strategy. He had not needed to prove exactly what happened to Violette K. He only needed to persuade jurors that prosecutors could not prove their version conclusively. And apparently, he succeeded. For the families, investigators, and members of the public seeking emotional closure. However, the result felt deeply unsatisfying. The legal system had delivered its answer, but uncertainty remained. Mancini left court a free man. Yet public suspicion never truly disappeared. In the eyes of many people, acquittal did not equal innocence. It simply meant the case had failed to cross the legal threshold required for conviction. One of the most important legal consequences of the verdict involved the principle of double jeopardy. Under the law at that time, once acquitted, Mancini could not later be retried for the same offense, even if new evidence emerged. The finality of that protection would become profoundly important decades later. Because although the courtroom battle ended in 1934, the story itself did not end there. Public memory of the Brighton Trunk murders endured for years. The unidentified pregnant woman still had no name. Her killer remained unknown. Violette K's death remained legally unresolved despite widespread suspicion surrounding Mancini. And Brighton itself carried the stain of the case long after the headlines faded. The city once celebrated for leisure and seaside elegance had become permanently associated with trunks, railway stations, concealed corpses, and one of Britain's most controversial acquittals. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect of the trial was not simply the verdict itself, but what it revealed about the limits of certainty. Courts seek definitive answers. Jurors are asked to separate truth from speculation. But some cases resist clean resolution entirely. In the Brighton trunk murders, violence, concealment, social prejudice, forensic limitation, and public fear all collided inside one courtroom. And when the proceedings ended, Britain was left with an unsettling reality. One dead woman remained unidentified forever. Another woman's suspected killer walked free. And the full truth behind the horrors of Brighton in 1934 still remained partly hidden in darkness. Some criminal cases end with a verdict. Others continue living long after the courtroom empties, carried forward through rumor, memory, and unanswered questions. The Brighton trunk murders belong to the second category. Even after the headlines faded and public attention shifted elsewhere, the case remained lodged inside British criminal history because it never truly resolved itself. One victim still had no identity. One suspected killer had walked free. And the deeper fears exposed by the murders, the vulnerability of women living on society's margins, the limitations of forensic science, and the uneasy realization that horrific violence could exist beside ordinary life undetected, continued echoing long after 1934 ended. For decades following the trial, Tony Mancini remained a controversial figure. Legally, he had been acquitted of murdering Violette K. Under the law, that verdict was final. Yet public suspicion never fully disappeared. Many people remained convinced he had escaped conviction through legal technicalities and the skill of his defense rather than genuine innocence. The image of Violette's body hidden inside a trunk beneath a bed remained too disturbing for the public to forget easily. The forged telegrams, the lies about Paris, the flight to London. Together they created a portrait that many observers found impossible to separate from guilt. But the legal system operates according to standards different from instinct. And so Mancini lived the rest of his life carrying a strange dual status, acquitted in court, yet permanently associated in public memory with one of Britain's most infamous murders. Then, more than 4 decades later, the story took another extraordinary turn. In 1976, shortly before his death, Mancini reportedly confessed to a journalist that he had in fact killed Violette K. The confession transformed the case from controversial acquittal into something even more unsettling. A possible example of truth emerging only after justice could no longer respond. According to the account attributed to Mancini, the death occurred during a violent argument between the couple. He claimed Violette attacked him with a hammer during the confrontation. In the struggle that followed, he allegedly grabbed the weapon and threw it back at her. The hammer struck her in the temple, killing her almost instantly. The confession did not describe an elaborate premeditated murder. Instead, it portrayed the death as the catastrophic outcome of a chaotic domestic fight fueled by anger and fear. Yet even if accepted as truthful, the confession still left many questions unresolved. How much of the account represented honesty? And how much reflected self-justification after decades of public suspicion? Was the killing truly accidental in the way Mancini implied? Or was the confession itself another attempt to reshape the narrative into something more sympathetic than intentional murder? Those questions could never be tested in court because of the principle of double jeopardy. Since Mancini had already been acquitted in 1934, he could not legally be retried for the same offense even after the confession became public. That legal reality became one of the most discussed aspects of the case in later years. To some observers, it represented the integrity of legal protections designed to prevent repeated prosecutions. To others, it felt like a devastating example of justice permanently slipping away. But while Mancini's confession eventually gave many people a sense of probable resolution regarding Violette K's death, no such closure ever arrived for the unidentified young woman discovered in the railway trunk. Decades passed. Forensic science advanced dramatically. Criminal investigation evolved into something investigators in 1934 could scarcely have imagined. DNA analysis emerged. National databases expanded. Missing person systems became more sophisticated. Yet despite all those advances, the girl with the pretty feet remained unidentified. Her head was never found. Her hands were never recovered. The person responsible for her death was never charged. In many ways, her case became even more haunting with time because she slowly transformed into a symbol of irreversible absence. Most murder victims at least retain their names in history. Their identities anchor memory. But this young woman lost even that. The newspapers had given her a nickname based on a physical characteristic. And over time, the nickname became the only label history preserved for her. The girl with the pretty feet. There is something profoundly tragic about that phrase. It sounds almost delicate until one remembers the reality behind it. An unidentified pregnant woman dismembered and distributed between railway stations while the world around her continued moving normally. Somewhere in Britain, she had once lived an ordinary life. She may have laughed with friends, written letters, fallen in love, worried about the future, feared the consequences of pregnancy, or dreamed about escaping difficulties no historical record now remembers. Yet, because her killer succeeded in removing the physical evidence most necessary for identification, history absorbed her as mystery instead of personhood. That loss reflects one of the cruelest dimensions of violence. Murder does not only end life. Sometimes it erases identity itself. The Brighton trunk murders also exposed the severe limitations of criminal investigation during the early 20th century. Modern audiences often underestimate how difficult identification could become before contemporary forensic technology existed. In 1934, investigators depended heavily on physical recognition and fragmented record systems. Without fingerprints or dental comparison, police frequently struggled to identify remains even when substantial portions of the body were recovered. Communication between police departments lacked the speed and coordination available today. Missing person reporting systems were inconsistent. Women living transient or marginalized lives could disappear without immediate alarm. The unidentified victim's pregnancy added another layer of social vulnerability. Britain in the 1930s was a society deeply shaped by moral judgment surrounding female sexuality, especially outside marriage. Women facing unwanted pregnancies often existed under enormous pressure. Illegal abortion networks thrived precisely because desperation created demand while the law denied. Safe alternatives. Investigators considered whether the victim may have died within that hidden world because such tragedies genuinely occurred, even though no evidence ultimately proved the theory. The fact it appeared plausible reveals how dangerous life could become for vulnerable women during that era. Violet Kay's story reflected similar vulnerabilities. As a former dancer and sex worker, she occupied a social position often treated with moral suspicion rather than empathy. During the investigation and trial, aspects of her lifestyle became tools within legal strategy and public commentary. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout criminal history. Women on the margins, sex workers, poor women, transient women, unmarried, pregnant women are often discussed less as individuals and more as reflections of societal anxiety or judgment. The Brighton cases forced uncomfortable questions about whose disappearances society notices immediately and whose suffering becomes easier to overlook. Another reason the murders endured in public memory was their extraordinary psychological horror. Concealed bodies have always disturbed people profoundly because they violate expectations about death itself. Burial, mourning, and recognition create emotional structure around loss. But trunks transform bodies into hidden objects moved anonymously through ordinary environments. That detail mattered enormously in Brighton. The crimes unfolded not in isolated wilderness or secret underground spaces, but within crowded public systems, railway stations, boarding houses, city streets. People unknowingly walked beside concealed remains while carrying on normal routines. That proximity between everyday life and hidden violence created lasting unease. The murders also became deeply embedded within British true crime culture. Over the decades, books, documentaries, radio programs, and later podcasts revisited the case repeatedly. Some focused on the unidentified victim and the mystery surrounding her identity. Others concentrated on the sensational trial of Tony Mancini or the later confession. The phrase Brighton Trunk Murders itself became iconic within crime history because it condensed so many disturbing themes into a single name: mutilation, concealment, anonymity, and unresolved justice. Yet there is always a risk when notorious cases become cultural artifacts. Repetition can gradually transform suffering into entertainment. The Brighton Trunk Murders continue attracting fascination partly because the details are so grotesque and strange. But beneath the sensational elements were still two women whose lives ended violently. One left hidden beneath a bed, while decomposition filled a rented room. Another reduced to body parts distributed across railway stations with her identity permanently erased. The challenge in revisiting such cases is remembering that mystery should never overshadow humanity. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Brighton Trunk Murders is how incomplete the story remains. Even today, investigators never conclusively established whether the two trunk cases were connected in any meaningful way beyond geography and concealment method. The unidentified woman's killer was never found. Her final movements remain unknown. Her family, if they ever searched for answers, never received them publicly. And even Mancini's later confession regarding Violette K arrived decades too late for legal accountability. The case therefore exists in a strange space between solved and unsolved. One death gained a probable explanation without judicial resolution. The other disappeared almost entirely into darkness. Today, Brighton remains what it has always outwardly appeared to be: a lively seaside city filled with tourists, cafes, and trains arriving from London. Visitors walk through the station where the trunk was discovered without realizing the history attached to the building. The sea continues rolling against the shoreline exactly as it did in 1934. Time moves forward. Cities reinvent themselves, but certain crimes leave permanent shadows behind them. The Brighton Trunk Murders endure not simply because of brutality, but because they confront listeners with uncomfortable truths about absence. The absence of identity, the absence of certainty, the absence of justice fully realized. One woman became famous precisely because nobody knew her name. Another woman suspected killer escaped conviction and confessed only when punishment had become impossible. Together, their stories reveal how violence can fracture memory itself, leaving behind gaps no investigation can completely repair. And perhaps that is why the case still disturbs people nearly a century later. Not because the crimes were uniquely monstrous by historical standards, but because they remind us how fragile recognition can be, how easily a person can disappear in a systems unequipped to protect them, how often truth arrives incompletely, if it arrives at all. Somewhere beneath the noise of Brighton's modern streets lies the memory of two women connected forever by trunks, secrecy, in a city that briefly became known not for leisure or beauty, but for death hidden in plain sight. Nearly a century has passed since the Brighton Trunk Murders first horrified Britain, yet the case still feels strangely unfinished, as though part of it remains suspended somewhere between documented history and collective nightmare. Most notorious crimes eventually settle into clear categories: Some are solved conclusively and remembered as triumphs of investigation. Others remain unsolved mysteries frozen around a single unanswered question. But the Brighton trunk murders resist that kind of simplicity. The case exists in fragments. One woman identified but denied legal justice. Another woman permanently unnamed. One suspected killer acquitted before later confessing. And a city forever marked by crimes that seem to emerge from beneath the surface of ordinary life without warning. Over time, the murders evolved beyond police records and newspaper archives into something almost symbolic within British criminal history. They came to represent a collision between modern urban society and the terrifying realization that anonymity could protect both victims and killers alike. Brighton in 1934 was not an isolated village hidden from the world. It was a busy tourist city connected directly to London through constant railway movement. Thousands of people passed through its stations every week. Boarding houses filled and emptied rapidly. Visitors arrived carrying luggage and left without attracting attention. The city's very openness created opportunities for disappearance. That tension between visibility and invisibility remains one of the most haunting aspects of the entire story. The victims were surrounded by people constantly, yet neither woman received immediate protection from the systems around them. Violette K. vanished after a public argument witnessed by others. Yet her disappearance initially blended into the instability of nightlife culture. The unidentified young woman traveled, or was transported, through one of the busiest railway systems in England. Yet nobody intervened before her remains were discovered decomposing inside abandoned luggage. In both cases, ordinary life continued around extraordinary horror. That uncomfortable reality helps explain why the case continues to disturb modern audiences. The murders did not occur in hidden wildernesses or remote criminal underworlds entirely separated from society. They unfolded inside familiar public spaces, train stations, cafes, rented rooms, city streets. The violence existed beside normal routines, concealed beneath appearances people instinctively trusted. One of the enduring tragedies of the Brighton trunk murders is the contrast between memory and erasure. Violette K. at least retained her identity in history. We know her name. We know fragments of her life. We know she worked as a dancer and later as a sex worker in London. We know she argued publicly with Tony Mancini shortly before disappearing. We know her body was hidden inside a trunk beneath a bed. Even though the legal system failed to convict the man many believed responsible, history still preserved her existence as a recognizable individual. But the unidentified pregnant woman suffered a second disappearance after death, the disappearance of identity itself. There are countless murder victims throughout history whose names survive even when their killers do not. In this case, the opposite occurred. The killer vanished into history, but so did the victim. She became known only through a nickname created by newspapers fascinated by the condition of her feet. The girl with the pretty feet. The phrase still appears in documentaries and articles today, decades later. Yet every repetition carries an unsettling implication. Somewhere beneath that nickname was a real woman with a real name that history no longer remembers. The public became emotionally attached to the mystery of her identity. But mystery itself can become dehumanizing. The unknown woman risks becoming an idea instead of person. And perhaps that is the final violence committed against her. Not only the murder and mutilation, but the permanent transformation into a symbol rather than an individual life fully remembered. The Brighton trunk murders also reveal how deeply criminal investigations are shaped by the era in which they occur. Modern forensic technology has transformed expectations around murder cases. Contemporary audiences often assume DNA, surveillance footage, digital records, and centralized databases will eventually provide answers. But in 1934, police operated within an entirely different world. Investigators depended heavily on witness cooperation, physical recognition, and fragmented local record systems. The unidentified victim's missing head and hands effectively crippled many available methods of identification. Today, even partial remains might yield genetic connections through advanced forensic genealogy. In the 1930s, such possibilities were unimaginable. This historical limitation matters because it reminds us that many unsolved cases from earlier eras may not reflect investigative indifference so much as technological impossibility. Detectives working the Brighton cases pursued leads aggressively. They examined railway systems, questioned witnesses, explored theories surrounding illegal abortion networks, and circulated descriptions nationwide. But there are moments in criminal investigation where evidence simply stops existing. The Brighton case reached that boundary repeatedly. Another important legacy of the murders involves public attitudes toward marginalized women during the early 20th century. Both victims occupied socially vulnerable positions, though in different ways. The unidentified young woman was pregnant in a society where pregnancy outside marriage could bring shame, economic danger, and isolation. Violet K. survived through professions frequently treated with moral suspicion rather than empathy. The investigation and trial exposed how easily vulnerable women could disappear into environments where instability was normalized. Boarding houses, nightlife districts, transit employment, and informal social networks all created conditions where absence might not immediately trigger alarm. This pattern continues appearing across criminal history. Victims living at the margins of society often receive less protection before violence and less dignity afterward. The Brighton trunk murders therefore remain relevant not only as historical curiosities, but as reminders of how social vulnerability shapes exposure to harm. There's also something psychologically revealing about the public fascination surrounding the case. Britain in the 1930s was already deeply interested in sensational crime reporting. Newspapers competed aggressively for readership, and the trunk murders provided irresistible material: dismemberment, hidden corpses, railway stations, courtroom drama, mystery, and scandal. The media coverage transformed the crimes into national spectacle. Brighton itself became almost theatrical within public imagination, a glamorous resort city suddenly recast as a landscape of hidden death. Yet sensationalism creates complicated ethical questions. Public attention can help investigations by generating leads and maintaining pressure on authorities, but it can also distort victims into symbols and reduce complex tragedies into entertainment. The Brighton murders occupied both spaces simultaneously. They were genuine human catastrophes and major media events at the same time. Over the decades, the case inspired books, radio programs, documentaries, and eventually true crime podcasts because it contained all the structural elements audiences associate with compelling mysteries. But beneath every retelling remain two dead women whose suffering should not disappear beneath the atmosphere of intrigue. Tony Mancini's later confession added another disturbing layer to the legacy of the case because it reinforced one of the most uncomfortable possibilities in criminal justice: that legal outcomes and factual truth do not always align perfectly. Courts operate according to standards of evidence, procedure, and reasonable doubt. Public opinion often operates according to instinct and emotional certainty. Sometimes those systems arrive at different conclusions. Mancini's acquittal demonstrated the power of legal defense when direct proof remains limited. His later confession suggested that suspicion surrounding him may have been justified all along. Yet because of double jeopardy protections, the confession could never lead to retrial. Some observers viewed that result as a failure of justice. Others argued that preserving protections against repeated prosecution remained essential even in emotionally difficult cases. The debate continues because the case forces people to confront a painful reality. Justice systems are designed to minimize wrongful conviction, but doing so sometimes means guilty individuals avoid punishment when evidence falls short. The Brighton Trunk murders, therefore, remain unresolved not only factually, but morally and emotionally. There is no ending capable of fully satisfying the questions the case raises. Who was the unidentified pregnant woman? Who killed her? Was her death connected in any way to hidden medical networks or desperate circumstances surrounding pregnancy in 1930s Britain? Did her family ever suspect what happened? Did someone spend years waiting for her return without learning the truth? Those questions remain unanswered. Even the aspects of the case that appear more resolved still contain uncertainty. Mancini confessed, but only decades later and outside a courtroom. Violette Kay's death received no legal closure during her lifetime. The result is a case suspended permanently between known and unknown. Perhaps that ambiguity explains why the Brighton Trunk murders continue haunting British criminal history long after many supposedly more shocking crimes have faded from public memory. Human beings are unsettled by incompleteness. We want narratives to close cleanly. We want victims identified, killers punished, mysteries solved. The Brighton case denies those comforts repeatedly. Instead, it leaves behind fragments, a railway trunk abandoned in a station, a suitcase containing severed legs, a decomposing body hidden beneath a bed, forged telegrams sent to create illusions, a courtroom acquittal, and finally a confession arriving too late for consequence. Each piece reveals part of the story without ever assembling perfectly into certainty. Today, tourists still arrive in Brighton by train exactly as they did in 1934. They walk through stations carrying suitcases without thinking about the history attached to those spaces. Cafes along the seafront remain crowded during summer evenings. Music still drifts through the city at night. Time has transformed Brighton many times since the murders occurred. Yet traces of the case remain embedded invisibly within the city's identity. The buildings changed, generations passed, but somewhere inside the historical memory of Brighton still exists the summer when the city became associated not with leisure or romance, but with trunks carrying death through ordinary streets. And perhaps that is the final reason the case endures. The Brighton Trunk murders force us to recognize how fragile the boundary between normal life and hidden horror can be. A crowded railway station, a rented room, a trunk left unattended. Ordinary details capable of concealing unimaginable violence. The crimes remind us that history is often built not only from grand events and famous names, but from unresolved absences, the missing identity of a young woman, the silence surrounding her final hours, the uncertainty left behind after justice failed to arrive completely. In the end, the Brighton Trunk murders remain less a solved story than a lingering shadow. One victim remembered only through fragments. Another remembered through controversy and delayed confession. And beneath both stories, an enduring sense that some truths disappear not because nobody searched for them, but because the world in which the crimes occurred lacked the power to recover them before they were lost forever.